Hello everyone, and welcome to this rhetorical analysis of President Donald Trump's inauguration address. Those of you who follow this YouTube channel already know the deal. Each video seeks to perform a close reading or a rhetorical analysis of a compelling piece of popular culture. If you like what you see and hear, remember to subscribe to our channel. So to get things started, we will quickly review and consider the rhetorical triangle, and then we're going to roll the tape. Keep in mind that this is a rhetorical analysis. It is meant to be an unbiased and analytical look at the language used by the speaker being analyzed. In this case, it's Donald Trump. It's his inaugural address. I am sure that the comment section below will be far more politicized, but please keep in mind that this isn't the purpose of this video. It is an analysis of language, because language is important and language is power and so on. So, okay, let's get started. Our speaker is Donald J. Trump, the businessman and real estate mogul turned Republican presidential candidate, voted president-elect up until this very moment that we are analyzing here, the inaugural address, at which point he becomes, or became, the President of the United States of America. So, while this guy had plenty of credibility in terms of real estate and in business land, on reality TV, etc., he never quite had a handle on his ethos, his credibility on the political stage. His discourse relied very largely on ad hominem attacks against anyone who opposed him and vague and ungrounded claims about public policy. That might sound like it's biased, but it's not. A close reading of President Trump's transcripts during the presidential race showcases all of these things. It's why he catches a lot of flack, primarily from close readers. But I digress. The point is that Trump, in all of those moments, was playing the role of politician without ever having really been a politician. In business and in persuasion, we call this faking it until you make it, right? And clearly it's not a bad strategy. And here, Trump, making this speech, he was elected by the American people. In that sense, he's made it. Sure, it wasn't a popular vote, but it's enough to earn him the title of President of the United States of America, and that carries with it a world of ethos. His audience here is sweeping. It's one of the few times we can actually consider the world, right, like the entire world, a legitimate target audience. He's speaking to the folks who voted for him, sure, and there are moments where he highlights that specifically, but he's also speaking to the larger half of the nation who voted against him, and he's speaking to new colleagues in Washington, D.C., and he's speaking to the world, the rest of the world, to Mexico and to China and to Russia, everyone who he has been dragging into the spotlight throughout the course of his campaign. You can bet that they are all listening very carefully. And I know that. You know that. In delivering this address, President Trump definitely knows that. The kairos, the occasion, is his presidential inauguration. As such, he has a unique opportunity. People are listening and they are hanging on to his every word. Even Americans who voted against Trump are tuned in, are listening, if not live, then shortly thereafter, or to analyses like this one, hoping to hear something that they like. It is a very powerful moment. It is a powerful opportunity. And as for the message and the purpose, well, we will get to that as the address progresses. So let's listen to what he has to say.
Chief Justice Roberts, President Carter, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, fellow Americans, and people of the world, thank you.
Okay, the manner in which President opens his inaugural address may seem like a formality, but it's not. They're all similar, sure, but the nuances can be very telling. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson opened his inaugural address as follows: "Friends and fellow citizens called upon to undertake the duties of the first executive office of our country, I avail myself of the presence of that portion of my fellow citizens which is here assembled to express my grateful thanks for the favor with which they have been pleased to look toward me, to declare a sincere consciousness that the task is above my talents." That's the most important part, guys, that the task is above my talents, and that I approach it with those anxious and awful presentiments which the greatness of the charge and the weakness of my powers so justly inspire. In summary, Thomas Jefferson addressed friends and citizens. He thanks them for the honor, and he expresses the great task of being president is above his talents. It is very humble. Did Jefferson really believe that he didn't have what it took to be president? No, definitely not for an instant. And that confidence is most likely the reason why Jefferson felt so comfortable opening in such a humble and self-deprecating manner, because he knew that the world would say, "Oh shucks, Thomas, you are a brilliant president." And now fast forward to Barack Obama, and his opening line was much different.
My fellow citizens, I stand here today humbled by the task before us, grateful for the trust you've bestowed, mindful of the sacrifices borne by our ancestors.
It rings similar to Thomas Jefferson, without a laundry list of presidents that he adds himself to. Lincoln, much different, opened in a far more formal manner, saying, "Fellow citizens of the United States, in compliance with a custom as old as the government itself, I appear before you to address you briefly and to take in your presence the oath prescribed by the Constitution of the United States to be taken by the President before he enters on the execution of this office," right down to business. And a completely different effect, right? He evokes the Constitution, and as a result, Lincoln is pretty much synonymous with the Constitution in that moment. So the point is, they're all very similar, but they're all very different. And they're all very telling about the speakers who are, for the first time ever, taking their baby steps as presidents of the United States. Trump's baby steps were not entirely original. JFK, for instance, opened in a very similar way. But the question is, why? What is the effect? What is the intended effect? Why begin the inaugural address with his first words as President of the United States being a list of presidents? Trump says, "Chief Justice Roberts, President Carter, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, fellow Americans and people of the world, thank you." I'm immediately reminded of Dante's Inferno when Dante is hanging out in the first circle of hell and he sees some of the greatest poets who have ever lived, right? Big shots. Classical poets like Homer, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan. And his guide is another great poet, Virgil. And so what does he do as he sees them standing there in a circle? Well, he walks over and he stands in that circle with them. And it reads, "In that they made me one of their own band, so that the sixth was I, mid so much wit." In other words, he literally lists 5 of the biggest literary rock stars ever, and in his story he makes himself the 6th. He makes himself one of their peers. It elevates his status. It's a big shot of ethos. And similarly, when Trump lists his newly inherited peers, as well as his global audience, it elevates his status significantly.
We, the citizens of America, are now joined in a great national effort to rebuild our country and restore its promise for all of our people.
Having closely read many of Trump's speeches on the campaign trail, I immediately noticed that he is using collaborative language here. It starts early. He says, "We, the citizens of America," which is different than his usual course of language. He doesn't say, "I, the President of the United States," or "You, the citizens of America," but rather, "We, the citizens." It's a deliberate effort to begin bridging a deep divide that was created during his campaign and during the election as a whole. The collaborative language persists when he says, "We are joined in a great national effort for all of our people." He uses words like rebuild and restore because of the implications there. Saying that our country needs to be rebuilt is akin to saying that our country is in need of rebuilding, that it's perhaps dilapidated. Saying that it must be restored, right, and that we must restore its promise implies that its promise has been broken. But rather than striking with direct negativity, than saying our country is full of broken promises, or as Trump said during the speech in which he announced he was running for president, he said the American dream is dead. That's literally how he ended his speech.
Sadly, the American dream is dead.
Here, his language has a similar core, but it's angled with positivity. Saying we will resurrect the dream implies that it's dead, but he's not saying as directly that the American dream is dead. Rhetorically, it is brimming with positivity, with progress, and with that forward momentum. It is a deliberate shift on the same message that has carried Trump to the White House.
Together, we will determine the course of America and the world for many, many years to come. We will face challenges. We will confront hardships. But we will get the job done.
The collaborative language continues, and Trump uses a rhetorical device that presidents absolutely love. That device is anaphora. So, anaphora is the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses. It often is used to build momentum, to build rhetorical force, and to cement an idea into a listener's mind. It's very powerful. Humans love repetition, and they love things that happen in threes. And so he says, we will face challenges, we will confront hardships, but we will get the job done. Our brains as humans are crazy about that. It is anaphora, it is momentum, and again, there is collaborative progress.
Every 4 years, we gather on these steps to carry out the orderly and peaceful transfer of power.
Here we have a nod to tradition, and also an effort to further embed himself in the world of politics. Has Trump gathered on these steps every 4 years to transfer power? No, he hasn't. But the collective we, the American people, and the politicians of Washington, D.C., that he continuously clashes with and actually attacks throughout this speech, have. And with this sentence, he makes himself one of that group.
And we are grateful to President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama for their gracious aid throughout this transition.
Okay, so now this is interesting for a few reasons. It's interesting anytime Trump says kind words about Obama because he has, on very many occasions, attacked him. He was one of the most persistent and vocal supporters of the birther movement that claimed that Obama wasn't a U.S.-born citizen, which was, it turns out, absolutely ludicrous. And he has said many other negative things. But here, Trump says, we are grateful to President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama for their gracious aid throughout this transition. Interesting that he doesn't say, I am grateful, which might be too personal given his previous negativities and his anti-Obama image that perhaps he doesn't want to tarnish. And he is careful to explain what we, not he, but we are thankful for. Their gracious aid throughout the transition and nothing more.
They have been magnificent. Thank you.
Praise is a very powerful rhetorical device, and we don't often talk about it. So praise is powerful because even though the person being praised is gaining something from that verbal exchange there, right? In this case, the Obamas gained being called magnificent by the new president, which is nice, right? But the speaker, the giver of praise, gains something too. He gains the ethos in the domain of that praise. He gains credibility, in this case, when it comes to knowing what magnificence is. It's a combination of the subtle notion that it takes one to know one, and that managerial power that just comes from doling out evaluative statements onto others, even if they're positive. Here, Trump uses the language of managerial power. It's something that he's used to, and he does it well.
Today's ceremony, however, has very special meaning, because today we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another, or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
All right, here we have the twist. Trump calls this particular ceremony special early on, and he builds tension and suspense by prolonging the sentence. He's deliberately playing with the syntax. It has a very special meaning because today, we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another, or from one party to another, and the audience is just waiting for him to spit it out, right? Is just on the edge of their seats waiting to hear why it is, in fact, so special. What's different about this inauguration? It's a good move. It's a nice wind-up for a punch. So what's the punch? Well, Trump says that we are transferring power from Washington, D.C. and giving it back to you, the people.
And giving it back to you, the people.
And we give it back to you, the people.
This is interesting because, while it isn't literally true, he's seeking to link his presidency to the notion of giving power back to the people. It's something that people love, right? Obviously. It is also ironic because Trump lost the popular vote, and interesting because it implies that power was at some point taken away from the people by what he refers to quite simply as Washington, D.C. These are very big and very vague terms, and in truth, the people have just as much power today as they had before Trump was elected president, but the language he is using strives to create a much different sentiment.
For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed.
All right, so here we have some vintage Donald Trump rhetoric. He more clearly defines what he meant by Washington, D.C., who have allegedly taken power away from the people, and he claims that these unnamed individuals reaped the rewards of government while the people have bore the cost. It sounds like people are being made to work slave labor or are being exploited in some way so that politicians can have golden toilets and Lamborghinis. Now, I don't know how much of this is true, but the fact that he is the president, that this is his inauguration, certainly makes me wonder if he knows something that I don't. And we can thank the ethos that he's been building all along here, right? All that work that he did for ethos and credibility for that. And once again, Trump says, as he has many times on the campaign trail that led him to this presidency, that jobs left and the factories closed.
The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across our land.
So here, Trump narrows the scope of his audience. He says, their victories have not been your victories, deepening the divide between the previous administration, what he calls Washington, D.C., and the listeners of the speech, the citizens of our country. He repeats the phrase for emphasis using synonyms. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. He drives home the fact that there is a them and there is a you. And if you're not celebrating in the streets, you're a you, not a them. It's a very, very divisive kind of language, and yet Trump does not include himself in the equation at all. Is he part of them, the Washington, D.C., or is he part of the you, the struggling families across the land? Well, as it turns out, no, he isn't part of either, and in this way he casts himself as an outsider, as a new option, as a different and perhaps more powerful or righteous force that is now stepping in.
That all changes starting right here and right now, because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you.
Okay, this is great. Rhetorically, he isn't glancing past the point that he just raised about giving the people power. Instead, he is dwelling on it, and he says, this moment is your moment. And it's very familiar, in that it's almost exactly what Barack Obama said on the night of his presidential victory in 2008.
This is your victory.
They use the same device. Why? Because it's a great device. Because now they are both new presidents, and they're both trying to make the same point, to develop the same kind of reputation and the same kind of power. They don't want to be perceived as power-hungry or as tyrants or as undemocratic. And so they say to the people, here you go, this is yours. It's a very nice gesture, but it's purposeful. And as the address continues, Trump harps on it.
It belongs to everyone gathered here today and everyone watching all across America. This is your day. This is your celebration. And this, the United States of America, is your country.
So he's still doing it. It belongs to you. This is your day. This is your celebration. And he isn't done. He keeps going.
What truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. Everyone is listening to you now. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before.
All right, so more of the same, and Trump goes as far as to brand this group of people whose day it is the forgotten men and women of our country who will be forgotten no longer. If you are feeling forgotten, or if you were feeling forgotten before, or you felt powerless, well, then Donald Trump is speaking directly to you. You are his core. You're his target audience in the vast majority of his speeches and his public addresses. Trump follows this with a pretty significant hyperbole. He says, "You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before," which is very big and powerful language. It makes him sound like a rock star, like an underdog turned rock star. But to clarify, there were 62.9 million people who voted for Trump, right? And an estimated 800,000 attended his inauguration, which is not tens of millions. And to say that tens of millions came to become part of a historic movement, that is an exaggeration, right? It's not really true. And to say that it's the likes of which the world has never seen before, well, Trump's 62.9 million is not as large as Hillary's 65.8 million, right? Nor is his crowd of 800,000 as large as Obama's first inaugural crowd of 1.5 million. So that means this is hyperbole. It's a device. Is it a lie? Kind of. But more importantly, for our purposes in this analysis of language, it is an exaggeration. Why? Well, for starters, most people aren't doing fact-checking. Most people are passive listeners who retain and regurgitate this kind of information because it is coming from the president, and if you can't trust the president, then who can you trust, right? And also, as they say, history is written by the winners. So when students are analyzing Trump's inaugural address in 100 years in the context of his surprising election victory, this line will remain firmly planted in his speech. It's a part of his legacy now, and he is building that legacy, and the language is the primary source of his power.
At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens. Americans want great schools for their children, safe neighborhoods for their families, and good jobs for themselves.
Here, Trump echoes a core American belief, a belief that our nation was founded on and that was emphasized by the founding fathers, that a nation exists to serve its citizens and not the inverse, which would be something like the British monarchy that America broke free from so many years ago. And who can disagree with that? Right? Nobody can. And that's the point. Trump follows with additional statements that force agreement with everyone who is listening, that Americans want great schools for their children and safe neighborhoods for their families and good jobs for themselves. True and true and true for Americans and realistically for anyone anywhere. You can't argue with the fact that people want great schools for their kids. And in this way, Trump squeezes agreement from every member of the audience, right? It feels a little bit like the foot in the door technique that is heralded by businessmen and salesmen, which is, again, an area in which Trump has a lot of expertise and is very comfortable in. The foot in the door technique is a compliance tactic, where a person is first asked to agree to a modest request or a few modest requests before getting them to agree to a large request or larger request. So for car salesmen, that looks like come into the dealership and then let's take her for a spin, and then why don't you sign here for only $200 a month, right? Scientists call this process successive approximations, and it's very effective. There is no doubt about it. So here, the American people and the world nod in agreement. Yes, Americans want great schools for their children, safe neighborhoods for their families, and good jobs for themselves. The audience is being primed for compliance.
These are just and reasonable demands of righteous people and a righteous public. But for too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation.
Okay, so Trump breaks into some serious pathos here, and he starts using imagery to drive his points home. This is not a typical Trump maneuver, but it is a very presidential maneuver, so let's pay extra attention. He begins by pointing out that mothers and children are trapped in poverty. Okay, what about men? Why women and children? Is the image of women and children different in some meaningful way or more useful for his argument? And the answer obviously is yes. Does it evoke a more urgent crisis? Perhaps. For his listeners, his target audience? Perhaps. Does it evoke more powerful emotions, right? And he follows with a simile. Rusted our factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. This is very powerful and it's very, very dark language, especially for an inaugural address. I would say that is unprecedented darkness for an inaugural address. America the Beautiful just became America the Industrial Graveyard. In a speech that is uncharacteristically positive for Trump, this rings of his familiar negative rhetoric. He is talking about tombstones.
An education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge.
Again, an interesting choice of adjectives. Students that are young, well, obviously, and beautiful. Why beautiful? Why not something else? Why not smart or impoverished or full of potential or deserving or curious or something else that's perhaps a little less superficial than beautiful? Trump claims they are all deprived of all knowledge. But are they deprived of all knowledge? If you're a student watching this, are you deprived of all knowledge? Why say that?
And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
Okay, so it's very important to note that the carnage was branded as American carnage. Almost immediately, this was picked up by newspapers and headlines because it's a very, very powerful phrase, American carnage, which is to distinguish it from other kinds of carnage, and perhaps the kind that Trump often cites as the result of, let's say, lax immigration laws. What's more interesting is that he claims that this carnage stops right here and stops right now. The language is forceful, something you might expect an angry or powerful paternal figure to say, right? This stops right here and right now, not under my roof. And that is likely why it's here in this speech, to propagate the image of Trump as a powerful president. He's trying to show that he can lay down the law. But in reality, will this speech impact drug use or gang culture in urban areas? Will it all really stop right here, right now?
We are one nation, and their pain is our pain.
At this point in the speech, pronouns take a very confusing turn. There has been a lot of theirs and yous, being Washington, D.C. and the forgotten Americans, who have now apparently been transferred the power. But here Trump says, their pain is our pain, and follows with their dreams are our dreams, and their successes will be our successes. So who on earth is he talking about? The theirs, the ours, and the yous all become very tangled. Perhaps the recently mentioned mothers and children's dreams become our dreams, but in that case, does that suggest that they aren't listening to the speech? It's unnecessarily messy, but the point is that we're all in it together.
Their dreams are our dreams, and their success will be our success. We share one heart, one home, and one glorious destiny.
Destiny. Very American. The word destiny is ridiculously American, and presidents love it, Americans love it, history and history books love it. So much of our history and our national growth was based on the premise that it was America's destiny to expand, to move westward, and to become powerful. So here it is again, a nod to that deep American core and American tradition.
The oath of office I take today is an oath of allegiance to all Americans.
So this is the first time in this speech that Trump uses the word I. For the record, he says it 3 times throughout the course of this speech in 2 different moments, and this is one of those 2 moments. In it, he positions himself as the oath taker and binds himself to all Americans, another rhetorical swing at fostering unity. But more importantly, this raises the question of why Trump hasn't been using the word I. In previous speeches, it's among his most commonly used words. In his presidential announcement speech, he uses the word I close to 200 times.
And I can tell, I don't think it's, I beat China, I assume we're good, but I speak, I'm in competition. When I have to build, I pay, I said, I love, and I want to.
200. I think the actual number was 194. So why the shift? Does he feel like he no longer has to sell himself to the nation now that he's the president? Has this truly become a collaborative effort? Does I matter less and our and we suddenly matter much more? Or is his purpose simply to create the illusion of unity, to better serve his own presidential efforts? Does he think he'll get more done by saying we and our instead of I? Either way, this is a deliberate overhaul in the way that Trump speaks. So when you hear newscasters say that the inaugural address is old school Trump and that this guy who ran for office is the same no-nonsense guy delivering the inaugural address, they're either lying or they aren't paying attention. This is new rhetoric, my friends. It is more polished. It is more deliberately presidential, without question.
For many decades, we've enriched foreign industry at the expense of American industry, subsidized the armies of other countries while allowing for the very sad depletion of our military.
Here we have the beginning of a narrative of American decay. Pathos? Sure, lots of pathos. Some general statistics about spending tossed in, a little bit of logos for good measure, that's in there too.
We've defended other nations' borders while refusing to defend our own. And spent trillions and trillions of dollars overseas while America's infrastructure has fallen into disrepair and decay. We've made other countries rich, while the wealth, strength, and confidence of our country has dissipated over the horizon. One by one, the factories shuttered and left our shores, with not even a thought about the millions and millions of American workers that were left behind. The wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and then redistributed all across the world. But that is the past, and now we are looking only to the future. We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land.
Important shift here, because as the new president of the United States, Trump's audience is, without question, a global one. In saying that he is issuing a new decree to be heard in every city and every foreign capital, well, that's real. It's as real as it gets. If I said that right now, it's absolutely meaningless. World leaders don't care what I'm about to say. But here, Trump's next words are going to matter, and they're going to matter a lot. And he is deliberately perking up the ears of every city and every foreign capital.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families.
All right, here we hear the phrase America First, and gosh, that sounds like it's just aching to be the title of a new law or government program that impacts trade in America or something like that, doesn't it? It's hard to argue with a title like America First. So, what's the purpose? Why use the phrase America First? Well, if you're addressing a target audience that suspects that it is being threatened by foreign elements, by Muslims and by Mexicans, by people that are different, than themselves, and an audience that believes that to be an American, one must fit a relatively narrow set of criteria. Well then, the phrase America First serves the purpose of letting them know that these fears may be quelled, right? It's the opposite of saying the world will work together, or if we serve our interests internationally, then we'll benefit our interests at home. That's the opposite, right? This is a pivot with a catchphrase built for a very conservative audience, but titled for universal American appeal. It is very hard to argue with, as an American, with America First, without sounding like you care less about America, without sounding unpatriotic. Interestingly enough, Trump isn't the first person to use the phrase America First. In the early 40s, before America had entered into World War II, America First was an anti-war group, and its spokesperson, Charles Lindbergh, delivered a famous speech in which he said, quote, "I am not attacking either the Jewish or the British people. Both races I admire, but I am saying that the leaders of both the British and the Jewish races, for reasons which are as understandable from their viewpoint as they are inadvisable from ours, for reasons which are not American, wish to involve us in the war." So what was Lindbergh's point? That we shouldn't get involved in World War II, that we shouldn't enter into those foreign affairs, that we shouldn't make an effort to stop the Holocaust, because these weren't American concerns. Instead, he argued that we should put America first. Same exact words. And although placed in a different historical time period, there are very similar politics, very similar political forces and international forces at work in both contexts. So, otherwise, Trump continues to repeat the word American, and he drives home the point that the focus will be benefiting American workers and American families. Now, there might be a slight tinge of selfishness there too, right? It's a weird thing to hear that America is taking care of America, so back off. But he isn't really saying it in that way. He says America first, and then perhaps your country second, which makes a little more sense. It's more palatable. A nation must govern itself, and must put its interests first, right? But it raises the question of whether American interests and the interests of individual American workers or specific American families can sometimes be at odds. And if that's the case, well, what happens?
We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs.
Here the language gets much more aggressive. This is classic Trump style. Our borders are being ravaged, and companies are stolen, and our jobs are destroyed. These words are purposefully harsh, so as to paint each situation in as visceral a manner as possible. Our companies aren't moving to countries with friendlier tax codes. They are being stolen. Our jobs aren't being outsourced to more skilled individuals who happen to be overseas. They are being destroyed. It is very manipulative language. It stirs our emotions, and it is very effective.
Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. I will fight for you with every breath in my body, and I will never, ever let you down.
This is the second and the last time in this speech that Trump uses I. And he uses it to portray himself as a valiant warrior, laying his life on the line for the nation, sacrificing himself to ensure success for every citizen. Is that realistic? Is it true? Well, it doesn't matter. What matters is that he's fostering this association in America's mind. Trump as fighter, Trump as dedicated, Trump as trustworthy. Trump will never let you down.
America will start winning again, winning like never before. We will bring back our jobs. We will bring back our borders. We will bring back our wealth. And we will bring back our dreams.
Another anaphora, and the momentum of repetition is coupled with the growing abstraction of things being brought back, from jobs, which are fairly concrete, to borders, then wealth, and then finally dreams. It is purposeful escalation, and similar to the compliance tactics that we discussed earlier, it's far more effective than simply saying, we will bring back American dreams, period.
We will build new roads and highways and bridges and airports and tunnels and railways all across our wonderful nation.
Roads and highways and bridges and airports and tunnels and railways. So why so many ands and so few commas? Well, to emphasize all of the projects and all of the works that Trump is suggesting needs to be done, right? This seems like way more than simply saying we must repair the American infrastructure. Suddenly, it is far more tremendous undertaking.
We will get our people off of welfare and back to work, rebuilding our country with American hands and American labor.
Rebuilding with American hands. Hello, SYNECDOCHE. So, a synecdoche is a figure of speech in which a term for a part refers to a whole of something, and vice versa. So, American hands are American workers, and American labor is also American workers. But hands and labor are far more romantic images.
We will follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. We will seek friendship and goodwill with the nations of the world, but we do so with the understanding that it is the right of all nations to put their own interests first.
Here, Trump qualifies his earlier claims about putting America first. He uses straightforward logic to strip away some of those self-serving undertones, and it's effective. He doesn't claim it's an American right to put America first, but rather that it's the right of all nations to put their own interests first. It's a good rhetorical move.
We do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example. We will shine for everyone to follow.
This is a bit of a paradox, that we won't impose our way of life, but let it shine as an example, and will shine for everyone to follow. The purpose here may have been to emphasize that America isn't going to try and bully other nations into Americanization, but that our example will be great and worth following. The language, however, is a little slippery, and it doesn't quite nail the effect.
We will reinforce old alliances and form new ones, and unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the earth.
Here, Trump gives his audience a glimpse of his language of war. He claims that radical Islamic terrorism will be, quote, eradicated completely from the face of the earth. It is very heavy language. We won't just win the war, we will eradicate it completely from the face of the earth. That sounds like something that a god would say. It's the kind of language that world leaders use to describe their worst enemies. It's the kind of language that leaders of Islamic terrorist groups use to describe the Western world. And when they do, we see clips of it on the news. And it evokes very particularly patriotic emotions in us as Americans or as the Western world. So similarly, it would be safe to assume that this soundbite will likely be aired for radical Islamic terrorists too. And in this way, they are part of Trump's audience. And his message to them? Well, it is the threat of total annihilation. It is war.
At the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. And through our loyalty to our country, we will rediscover our loyalty to each other. When you open your heart to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice. The Bible tells us how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. We must speak our minds openly, debate our disagreements honestly, but always pursue solidarity. When America is united, America is totally unstoppable. There should be no fear. We are protected, and we will always be protected.
So while there are a lot of strong moments in this speech, this one gets a little screwy. Trump makes an allusion to the Bible, which presidents often do in their inaugural addresses. It resounds with a lot of Americans. It appeals to a higher authority. It provides a framework that's perceived as morally grounded, and so on, even though there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. It makes sense rhetorically. So Trump references the Bible in the context of living together in unity without prejudice. But then he adds that, quote, there should be no fear. We are protected and will always be protected. So who is he talking to, and who is he talking about? To minorities who are afraid of the police, or to someone else? The buzzwords that are floating around here require more clarity.
We will be protected by the great men and women of our military and law enforcement. And most importantly, we will be protected by God.
This is perhaps the strangest moment in the speech. Trump says that, most importantly, we will be protected by God. Now, it isn't strange to cite God in an inaugural address. It's actually quite routine for modern presidents to do so. In George W. Bush's inaugural address, he mentions God once. He says, abandonment and abuse are not acts of God. They are failures of love. And in his closing line, he says, God bless you and God bless America. In Barack Obama's inaugural address, he mentions God several times. He says, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. And he says, this is the source of our confidence, the knowledge that God calls on us to an uncertain destiny. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson, in his inaugural address, never says the word God, and he ends his speech referring to a godlike figure, but never saying God. He says, and may the infinite power which rules the destinies of the universe lead our counsels to what is best, and give them a favorable issue for your peace and prosperity. So mentioning God isn't a strange thing in and of itself, but claiming that Americans are protected by law enforcement, and more importantly, protected by God, well, that leaves the realm of tradition and rational thought, right? It enters into a realm of religiosity that is typically kept out of American politics. There is a line somewhere between the language of I pledge allegiance under God and in God we trust, and Trump's language here of we will be protected by God. And that requires a closer look.
Finally, we must think big and dream even bigger. In America, we understand that a nation is only living as long as it is striving. We will no longer accept politicians who are all talk and no action, constantly complaining but never doing anything about it.
This is interesting and almost funny because for the length of his campaign, Trump has been quite a complainer. Even in this speech, which has some glimmers of positivity, right? Many more so glimmers of positivity than we're used to coming from Trump. This paints a very negative image of America, something very unprecedented for an inaugural address. It's not like he stopped complaining even here. And yet he says, quote, we will no longer accept politicians who are all talk and no action, constantly complaining but never doing anything about it. Now, what Trump is trying to do here is to continue to cast himself as an outsider, right? Not a politician, not someone who is or was a part of Washington, D.C., not someone who has been complaining and yet not doing anything about it. So in a sense, he is striving to announce a positive change. In another sense, he is casting himself in a light outside of the politics of D.C., and in another sense, he is attacking the administration that he is replacing.
The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action. Do not allow anyone to tell you that it cannot be done.
So this has happened a few times in the speech. Here Trump says, do not allow anyone to tell you that it cannot be done. But we aren't sure what it is, right? It sounds motivational, something that a student council president or a football coach or a valedictorian might say to his or her graduating class. But what is the it? that can suddenly be done? Is it taking action instead of settling for empty talk? Isn't it obvious that that can be done, or is it something else? The purpose here is clearly to drum up enthusiasm. The language is building momentum into what would typically be a call to action at the ending of a speech or an argument. And he even uses that word. He says, now arrives the hour of action. There is pressure building.
No challenge can match the heart and fight and spirit of America. We will not fail. Our country will thrive and prosper again.
Right, so again, similar. He says, we will not fail. But again, we aren't sure what on earth he's talking about. What are we not failing at? The narrative is confusing. Rhetorically, the purpose of saying we will not fail is to build support and to heighten enthusiasm as the speech rallies toward its end. It does this even out of context, but it could be much stronger in context.
We stand at the birth of a new millennium, ready to unlock the mysteries of space, to free the earth from the miseries of disease, and to harness the energies, industries, and technologies of tomorrow.
So about 2 decades into the 21st century, Trump reminds us that we are still standing at the birth of a new millennium. Why? Because it sounds good, because it makes it sound like we are still standing and continually standing at the edge of the future, whatever that means, the edge of the future. Even that is a phrase that means practically nothing. Aren't we always standing at the edge of the future? But it evokes a feeling that is very hopeful and exciting and filled with technological promise that things will be better. Rhetorically, it makes sense to ramp up hope at the end of the speech, to end on a high note, not with the sorrowful notion of factories littering the American landscape like tombstones. He has to turn the sentiment around here at the end, and he does.
A new national pride will stir our souls, lift our sights, and heal our divisions.
A new national pride will stir ourselves. Where to begin with that phrase? Well, okay, there is more hope in this, a promise for a new national pride, although again, it's so abstract and ungrounded by any claims or any evidence that we're not really sure what that means. But superficially and rhetorically, this is an effort to build more hope.
It's time to remember that old wisdom our soldiers will never forget, that whether we are black or brown or white, we all bleed the same red blood of patriots.
Trump, often criticized for intolerance and racism, tells the world that it's time to remember that regardless of the color of one's skin, we all bleed the same red of patriots. As we mentioned earlier, dispensing praise gives speakers a certain kind of power. Here, in dispensing advice that we must remember that Americans are Americans, regardless of race, that is also a power move. He positions himself as an authority on fighting prejudice. If you've been following Trump's speeches on the campaign trail, you know that this is a silly thing. But outside of that context, Trump, the President of the United States, takes an anti-racist stance. Is he trying to combat the stigma his campaign has brought onto his reputation? Perhaps. Is he trying to reinvent himself? Perhaps. Is he actually trying to combat racism in the United States? We can only guess at what his actual motivation is here, but we do see the effect. He is, again, striving for presidential rhetoric and national unity and positioning himself as an authority.
We all enjoy the same glorious freedoms, and we all salute the same great American flag.
So, when the America that you're speaking to contains about 2 million more people who voted for another candidate and you are taking office, what do? It's a very tricky rhetorical situation to be in, right? It is a very tricky kairos. It is a tricky occasion. But a good move is reminding everyone that we all salute the great American flag, the same great American flag, because it's impossible to argue against. It is brimming with patriotic virtue, and it does work to unify all American listeners.
And whether a child is born in the urban sprawl of Detroit or the windswept plains of Nebraska, they look up at the same night sky, they fill their heart with the same dreams, and they are infused with the breath of life by the same Almighty Creator.
This sentence, it's worth listening to again. Who does this sound like?
And whether a child is born in the urban sprawl of Detroit or the windswept plains of Nebraska,
when there was despair in the Dust Bowl and depression across the land.
Yeah, so it sounds like Obama. It is packed with imagery, the urban sprawl of Detroit or the windswept plains of Nebraska, looking up at the same night sky. This is poetic language, and it's the only moment in the speech that's like this. So, rhetorically, using imagery like this works to strengthen ideas by marrying pathos through details and images with logos through the facts of these individual situations. But it's the only time in the speech that Trump takes this tone, and it literally feels like it was copy and pasted from one of Obama's previous speeches. It's very effective, right, for a few reasons. Now, why would Trump want to evoke Obama?
So to all Americans in every city, near and far, small and large, from mountain to mountain, from ocean to ocean, hear these words: you will never be ignored again.
Why say from ocean to ocean instead of from sea to shining sea? Why not invoke a patriotic anthem? Wouldn't it have been more effective if he had? Perhaps. But he didn't. Instead, he says, from mountain to mountain, from ocean to ocean, and he tells his listeners, you will never be ignored again. This, of course, narrows the audience from all Americans to Americans who have been or felt ignored. If you feel or have felt ignored, then Trump is talking to you. If you haven't felt ignored, then you are not in his crosshairs. It's also worth mentioning that this, like many of the phrases that he's thrown into the address that seem lined with positivity and hope, are actually attacks in disguise. You will never be ignored again is a roundabout way of saying to the previous administration that you have been ignored. It is another dig.
Your voice, your hopes, and your dreams will define our American destiny. And your courage and goodness and love will forever guide us along the way.
The address is ending, and this is very important because people remember introductions and conclusions most of all. And he opened with a list of presidents' names. Now he's closing with words like voice, hopes, dreams, destiny, courage, goodness, and love. He echoes the idea that people are in control, that their love will forever guide us, which again is so abstract it doesn't actually mean anything at all. But rhetorically, it builds enthusiasm and positive sentiment. And he says American destiny, which is apparently the God-given right of America to be the best in the world. America first, protected by God. Got it? That is what this speech is about. American destiny, America first, protected by God.
Together, we will make America strong again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And yes, together, we will make America great again.
Ending with a presidential anaphora. I was hoping for a curveball here, but anaphora it is. We will is repeated 4 or 5 times consecutively, each time saying we will, which is both collaborative and forward-looking. These lines also use a rhetorical device that is like anaphora, except instead of repeating words at the beginning of each clause, they repeat at the end. Here, he begins with we will and ends with again. We will make America strong again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. So why repeat again? Because in that mess of hope he is trying to build, he continuously seeks to remind the American people that things are not good now, that America presently is not strong, is not wealthy, is not proud, and is not safe. The rhetorical device, repeating again, is called epistrophe. And the effect? Well, it's often referred to as fear-mongering, which is defined as the act of deliberately arousing public fear or alarm about an issue. Why? Well, to propose himself as the solution, to create a visible and low bar that he can and will surmount. Because if tomorrow you feel safe, it can be said that we did indeed make America safe again. And you can bet in 4 years you'll hear that phrase in Trump's campaign. We made America great again, or keep America great. Unless, of course, the disenchanted Americans that Trump has convinced he is their leader, even though he is a billionaire, and has been exploiting disenchanted Americans for the length of his career as a businessman and real estate mogul, if they realize that America is, for them, pretty much the same America 4 years later, well, then he may have some trouble, and the slogan may need additional work.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.
Okay, so this is about par for the course when it comes to American presidents ending their inaugural addresses. But it's interesting to note that it's also par for the course when it comes to American presidents delivering their victory speeches following an election. And Trump did not mention God at the end of his victory speech. Instead, he ended by saying, "I love this country. Thank you very much. Thank you to Mike Pence. Thank you." That's much different than God bless America. So judging by the rhetorical decision to end with the traditional line here, we see a deliberate effort to be more presidential, to uphold this tradition, and perhaps to conform to that presidential mold that the country is perhaps expecting and hoping for, or perhaps not hoping for. The language here suggests that Trump is making a concerted effort to reinvent and project a different image than what his campaign made him out to be. But it's important to recognize that this language is about as controlled as it gets, and it's likely that we're going to see much more of this kind of language in the future. Regardless of whether Trump says he wrote the speech himself or not, as the President of the United States, he's going to get a lot of help. He's already had a lot of help, and there are going to be a lot of filters, and we're going to see much more of this kind of rhetoric. It's the press conferences and the off-the-cuff remarks and informal conversations that will, as usual, provide deeper insights into the president rather than the larger administration. We shall see, my friends, we shall see. Until next time, remember to subscribe to this channel if you like what you hear and what you see, or if you're an English teacher, head over to teachargument.com to grab great resources for teaching argument.